Recording in progress.
Hey, everybody. It's good to be with you again. Welcome to Adult Sunday School. As you can see on the screen, we are focusing our time in Ezra, and this will be our last week on the book of Ezra. In the coming weeks, we are going to be transitioning over to Nehemiah and then Malachi. It's possible with the next 2 weeks that we may not have recorded sessions. I'm going to check with the powers that be and ask if it's okay. I intend to record a lesson for the next 2 Sundays. But we do have Life Action coming to us, and when they descend on the campus and take over, there will be no in-session Sunday school classes for the next 2 weeks. And so with that, it's possible they may not want me to record an online lesson, so that way others will kind of be funneled into what's going on with Life Action. If any of that's going to be streamed or whatnot, I don't know. So more to follow on that. I would just simply say, check here next week to see if a recorded lesson has been posted. I don't think there will be an official announcement made from the church via email or whatnot. And of course, I'm sure there might be some of you out there who are not members of Kingsville Baptist and are tapping in week to week from wherever you are. And as always, I don't know who you are, but I sincerely appreciate that. And if we do wind up meeting for the next 2 weeks, then we're going to take some time looking at the 118th Psalm next week, and then transition to the one and only week we have in Esther before we get to the 3 sessions of Nehemiah, and then the final lesson we have in all of the Old Testament, that being Malachi. So more to follow. But anyway, just as a reminder of what we're doing here, we're focusing on this post-exilic material. We started this quarter by looking at some of the material from Jeremiah, a couple of sessions from Daniel, nothing from Ezekiel, which would have helped, of course, just expound a little further as to what the period of the exile was like. But with that, we got some measure of understanding of what things were like for Israel while she was being pulled out of her land, and of course, while she was off in exile in Babylon. And now what we're focusing on is the material that comes after the exile is over with. And what we're attempting to try to do with the focus that I'm hoping to help you better understand this with is, what are the expectations that this community of Jews are beginning to develop as goes the words of the prophets in the pre-exilic period? We're talking about gentlemen such as Isaiah and his contemporaries, Amos, Hosea, Jonah, and Micah, and what they had to say with respect to the imminent judgment that God was going to be bringing on the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, and the unavoidable exile that God was going to consign them to. But of course, the hopeful blessing that would come after the exile was over with, and that was the advent of God's kingdom. And this would be ushered in by the Davidic descendant promised to lead them in this new and final exodus that would see an unprecedented period of peace, prosperity, and a never-ending kingdom that he would rule and reign over. But as we have now crossed the threshold of the exile ending and the new Exodus period beginning, the things that actually are transpiring are not exactly the way they anticipated them to be. Remember, just a few weeks ago, we were talking about, as we were focusing on the opening material of Ezra, the fact that God has now fulfilled the promise that was first spoken by Isaiah, that he would stir up the heart of a man named Cyrus. And from Isaiah's utterances, we have really no bearing on who exactly that is and what role he plays, because it's not mentioned that he's a Persian from Isaiah's perspective. But when these events are being lived out in real space and time, it's very clear to these audiences that Ezra is living amongst, and if he's the one writing this material that bears his name, that they would have been familiar with the fact that Cyrus is his identity has become much clearer, in that the whole known world from the biblical purview knows who this man is, because he is the ruling emperor of the Persian Empire that now governs all of this area. From the book of Esther, 127 provinces that span from India all the way to the Ethiopian kingdom of Kush, and all the way north to Turkey, or what we would call modern day Turkey, and even beyond that, as goes the height of Persian power, beyond Cyrus. So with that in mind, Cyrus is the one who is the grantor of their release to go back to their homeland. He is the one who issues the edict that The city of Jerusalem is to be rebuilt, and the temple is to be rebuilt inside of it. And to give all of these offerings for these people to be able to go and accomplish this mission with. And not only that, but to grant them even greater reprieve by giving them the vessels from the temple that were taken by Nebuchadnezzar when he laid siege to the city. And so, of course, if the Davidic descendant as Messiah is the one who is supposed to begin this process of them going through a new exodus out of the exile of their captivity, but Cyrus is the one who initiates it, then that certainly, in a sense, throws them for a loop. Again, we have the words of Isaiah that spoke to the certainty of this happening, but from his perspective, the identity of who this character Cyrus is a mystery. But now that it's well known to this post-exilic community, I'm sure that leaves them somewhat wondering as to who exactly or how exactly the rest of this Exodus is supposed to shape up. And with that, when is the Davidic descendant coming? If Zerubbabel, the descendant of David, who was the governor appointed by Cyrus, that led that first wave of exiles back and began to oversee the project of the temple being rebuilt and the city wall. That's something I think that often escapes us, is the city wall was being rebuilt until a cessation was called, and it was not picked up again until Nehemiah came along. And there's evidence in the book of Ezra that clearly bears that out. We may get into that, we might not. But having said that, the point being that if Zerubbabel was never crowned king, then when is the Davidic descendant supposed to come along? Surely he'll be descended from Zerubbabel, but are they just waiting with anticipation for the decision to be made by the Persian emperor that the land of Judah may have a king back? And if so, who is the person he's going to choose? Will the Lord stir his heart to appoint a Davidic descendant? Well, century after century goes by, and Persia winds up falling out of power as the Greeks wind up conquering them. And the Greeks have no sympathies whatsoever to the land of Judah and carving them out to be an independent regional power and granting them sovereignty. And we have no evidence in history that God stirred up any Greek king's heart, whether Alexander or after he died and his empire was divided up to his 4 generals, that being Seleucus, that carved out the Syrian monarchy and the dynasty of Seleucid kings that followed after him, or the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled from Egypt. And with all of that, eventually we understand that the Greeks fall out of power as the Romans slowly, methodically begin to conquer the Greek kingdoms and assimilate all of that territory into their empire, or at least a good portion of it on the western side. And then the land of Palestine, or the region of the Levant, kind of becomes the dividing ground between what will become the Roman Empire to the west, and then to the east, the Parthian Empire and various other kingdoms and city-states and what have you. So they don't see these things come to pass quite the way that these pre-exilic prophets were forecasting and shaping things up to be, as goes their expectations. So what we're exploring is how are their expectations beginning to change, and how does this feed information into and help us understand what the expectations were at the end of that 5 centuries that Daniel forecasted until the arrival of Messiah, and of course the attitudes and sense of expectation and anticipation that we see in the New Testament scene when Jesus arrives, not only at the time when he is born, as goes the birth narratives from Matthew and Luke, but of course when he winds up coming onto the scene and is now publicly ministering amongst all the regions where Jews exist in the land of their ancestral birth, that being Galilee to the north, Judea to the south, and making frequent trips in between and calling disciples out and letting it be widely known that he is Messiah without having to say so much to everyone, letting people figure this out as the Spirit's moving hearts and convicting people to recognize the clear and obvious signs that the prophets spoke of, but then wrestling with the way that he's doing things and understanding that this isn't quite the way the prophets said it was going to be, but he works to help clarify some of those erroneous and even biased expectations in their minds. So a long and drawn out introduction to simply say that's what we're doing as we're going to study this material as we've studied what's come before and what will come after. So Ezra chapter 4, the very last verse of chapter 4, the first two verses of 5, and then this section from chapter 6. So now the construction of God's house in Jerusalem had stopped and remained at a standstill until the second year of the reign of King Darius of Persia. But when the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem, in the name of the God of Israel who was over them, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, son of Jozadak, began to rebuild God's house in Jerusalem. The prophets of God were with them, helping them. Just as an aside here, to help us somewhat chronologically understand what is historically going on here. So, of course, Cyrus is the reigning Persian monarch at the time when Babylon is conquered. He is the one that issues the edict, as we've said, that allows all of these peoples to go back to their homelands if they so choose, to give massive sums of money from the treasuries and, of course, offerings taken up from other peoples around these areas that these non-indigenous exiles are living at if they choose to go back to their homelands, to help them to fund their journey and, of course, to even fund the building of sacred sites. So Judah, because Judah and Benjamin really are the only two tribes that have stayed in somewhat unified, cohesive existence in the time of the exile, because about 120-ish to 150 years before, not a genius or a whiz at doing math on the spot like that, I guess it's closer to 150 years before the Nebuchadnezzars, before the Babylonians come to lay siege to the kingdom of Judah and then destroy the city of Jerusalem. The Assyrians before them had already taken the northern kingdom, Israel, captive and deported them off into exile. And so they dispersed them in different geographic areas than the locations where the Babylonians took the inhabitants of the kingdom of Judah, which were just the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin. All that to simply say that as Cyrus is giving these people leave to go back to their homeland, eventually he will die. And when he does, I think he's killed in battle. Then his son, Cambyses II, named after Cyrus's father, is going to be the one to take over and rule for roughly 8 years. And after he dies, there will be another one, a man by the name of Barda. Some call him Pseudo-Smyrtus. Various records call him by different names, but the consensus is this man reigned for less than a full year. And then he is deposed by Darius, who becomes known as Darius the Great in antiquity. And of course, he is not a direct descendant of Cyrus, so this marks the advent of an entirely new dynasty. The reason why I bring this up is because it's during this period that, as would be the case all throughout antiquity, this certainly leaves the Persian Empire very volatile and vulnerable to the prospect of several different kingdoms that were conquered either by Persia or their predecessors, the Babylonians and the Assyrians, wanting to exploit this opportunity to try to rise up, rebel. And if there are several rebellions going on simultaneously, then the thought would be the Persians can't put them all down, and that these kingdoms would be able to overthrow Persia together, perhaps. But that doesn't happen. Not to say that there aren't rebellions at the time of King Darius, but the reason why this is important is because these people who are going to be sending correspondence via letters to King Darius to say, this is what these Jews are doing. Please let a search be done in the royal archives to see whether or not this is okay, because they go and inquire first as to why are you rebuilding the temple? There has been a period now in which, after the foundation of the temple was laid, a period of roughly 15 years will go by after these people had been discouraged, stopped building the temple, did not continue on after the building of the foundation. At least that's what we gather from the accounts, before they started actually building upon the foundation to complete the temple. We know from here, Haggai and Zechariah began to commend the people. This is what the Lord wants you to do. And the opening chapter of Haggai's very short scroll tells us why and how the Lord got their attention. And with that, they began to follow in faith and started building the temple, but no one gave them permission. But in truth, no one really told them to stop building the temple either. And we'll see that here in just a second. But nonetheless, they are actually going back to the project and starting to build again. And the concern on the part of these regional powers in this area that rule the area in the name of Persia are concerned that this might be seen as a measure of rebellion against Darius. And they are sending correspondence to him to not only inform him this is what's going on, but to raise his awareness that this potentially could be an act of rebellion, and then wait expectantly on what his instructions will be, which will perhaps give them authority to act forcefully against these Jews if Darius does not indeed want the temple to be built. So, moving forward, in chapter 6, verse 13 through 22, then Tattenai, governor of the region west of the Euphrates River, Shethar-Bozenai, and their colleagues diligently carried out what King Darius had decreed, which at this point King Darius has issued the decree that the temple is to be rebuilt and no one is to stand in their way. So the Jewish elders continued successfully with the building under the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah son of Iddo. They finished the building according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and King Artaxerxes of Persia. This house was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Just as another aside here, as I taught last week, and I continue to stick with this as the conventional chronology only because it's the easier way of explaining this. But I do recognize, depending on what sources you have available to you, it's entirely possible that you might be reading conflicting information that suggests that the chronology that's listed here in Ezra is very difficult to discern. And I will admit that seems to be the case. One of the reasons being, and there are some examples of manuscripts from this particular time that give clear evidence to the fact that many of these kings used different titles for themselves. And what I mean by that is while we see the names Darius or Cyrus, Ahasuerus or Artaxerxes being recognized regnal names for kings who ruled as part of the Persian dynasties, yet these titles also have significance as goes meanings to their names. A very good example would be how the writer of Hebrews uses the name Melchizedek. The name Melchizedek itself means king of righteousness, but he points out the fact that he is the king of Salem, which the word Salem means peace. And so he attaches the significance to Melchizedek's meaning by saying or attributing to him that he is not only the king of righteousness, but the king of peace. The term Darius in the Persian language means doer. So if a king, perhaps his proper name is Artaxerxes, but he does something great, and he is a very forward-looking or advancing king, as goes his own agenda and whatnot, it's entirely possible that he might ascribe to himself the term or title Darius, even though his proper name is Artaxerxes, because he wants people to recognize that he was a doer of great things that he might be recording as part of the manuscripts being written or the monuments being carved out to his name where these deeds are etched in stone. And again, there are manuscripts from this time in which a particular king might attribute several titles to himself in which his name might be Artaxerxes, but he would also be known as Darius. Now, if you're confused, you should be, because it makes it all the more difficult to determine who exactly are these kings. Cyrus seems to be just Cyrus, but Darius in this instance could very well be the Darius who rules and founds a new dynasty after Cambyses, the son of Cyrus the Great, has ruled, died, and then the kingdom was potentially usurped for a period of roughly 8 months by another character named Barda or Pseudo-Smyrtus until he was deposed by Darius. Or it's possible that Cyrus's son Cambyses may be the Darius figure here mentioned in Ezra 6. And that would mean the king ruling after him, not legitimately recognizing Barda, but Darius the first could be King Artaxerxes. Or it could be that we're mentioning Cyrus here and Darius the Great after him, but Darius the Great could also be known as King Artaxerxes. Now, I don't have time to go into all of this as to why this matters. But I will say for the moment, the reason why it matters is because in the book of Ezra, it's entirely possible that we begin to get confused as to what king is ruling when and how this marries up with other sections of scripture. Because if the house of the Lord was built and finished in the 6th year of King Darius, but he rules for more than 20 years, and the king that succeeds him is not Artaxerxes, but Xerxes the first, and Artaxerxes is his son who rules after him, then there was no building of the temple in his day. Now, it's possible this could be mentioning the beautification of the temple, but again, there's really nothing here that seems to suggest that. So let's move on, and we might come back to this later on in the lesson. This house was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which is the 12th month of the religious calendar year, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. Then the Israelites, including the priests, the Levites, and the rest of the exiles, celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. For the dedication of God's house, they offered 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, as well as 12 male goats as a sin offering for all of Israel, one for each Israelite tribe. They also appointed the priests by their divisions and the Levites by their groups to the service of God in Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses. The exiles observed the Passover on the 14th day of the 1st month. And the reason why is because, again, the month of Adar is the 12th month of the religious calendar year. So the next month would be the 1st month of the religious calendar year, the month in which Passover will be celebrated. All of the priests and Levites were ceremonially clean because they had purified themselves. They killed the Passover lamb for themselves, their priestly brothers, and all the exiles. The Israelites who had returned from exile ate it, together with all who had separated themselves from the uncleanness of the Gentiles of the land in order to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. They observed the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days with joy, because the Lord had made them joyful, having changed the Assyrian king's attitude toward them, so that he supported them in the work of the house of the God of Israel. One more aside, you might wonder, well, why does it say the Assyrian king? Because there isn't an actual king ruling in the former lands of the Assyrians. They were overthrown by the Babylonians, and now the Babylonians have been overthrown by the Persians. The reason why, though, could very well be that they are no doubt attributing the title of Assyrian king to that of Darius, and of course before him, Cambyses and Cyrus. The reason why they're calling them the Assyrian king, perhaps, is because the Assyrian king, who was ruling at the time when the northern kingdom went off into exile, was the one who started this process of both houses of Israel and Judah being conquered and deported off into exile. And now God is changing the heart of the monarch who is ruling over the former territorial holdings of the Assyrians, and also now holds within his hands, to some extent, the fate of God's covenant people, the descendants of Jacob, and allowing them to not only go back to their homeland, but to receive the rest as symbolically portrayed by them being able to rebuild the temple. All right, so let's take a moment to pray, and then we'll jump on into this. Lord Jesus, we are grateful, again, as we always hope to be, with open sincerity and true sincerity, for how you have guided us, how you have directed us, how you have provided for us over the course of this past week. We give you praise for all you are, for all you do, because you are worthy. These next few moments, Lord, may all that is said and done give you praise and glory. May you open our minds to help us understand how these parts of Scripture connect with each other, and of course, everything else that surrounds it, and help us to understand more as goes the anticipation and the understanding that these people who are living out these events began to have with respect to what you would do when you arrived on the scene. And of course, how this influences the gospel material that comes after it. And ultimately, what we should be appreciating as goes the influence of this book and how it interplayed with the writers of the New Testament. Lord, we ask this, that you would challenge our faith and help us to better understand our role in your agenda as goes your kingdom. In your holy name we pray. Amen. So I'm going to jump back for a second to Ezra chapter 3 to try to help give us a little bit more clarity in our context. In verse 1 and 4, we are told that when the seventh month arrived, now this is the seventh month of the religious calendar year. I know it can be a little bit confusing when we go from the seventh month of the second year of King Darius or something to that extent. Trying to situate this on an actual calendar can be a little bit daunting, but thankfully we have commentaries and whatnot that help clarify this, not to say they always get it right, because of course, where you have one commentative opinion, you might have other commentative opinions that dissent and disagree and give good reasons for why they do. And we just have to pray and discern as to what exactly makes better sense as to what exactly is going on. But nonetheless, this is indeed a reference to the seventh month of the religious calendar year. So when the seventh month arrived and the Israelites were in their towns, the people gathered as one in Jerusalem, and they celebrated the festival of shelters as prescribed, and they offered burnt offerings each day based on the number specified by ordinance for each festival day. The first mention of the festival of shelters comes to us in Leviticus chapter 23. So there the Lord spoke to Moses, and he told the Israelites that the festival of shelters or tabernacles to the Lord begins on the 15th day of this seventh month, and the seventh month being the most busy month on the religious calendar schedule, because you had not only the Feast of Tabernacles, but you had the Day of Atonement and a Feast of Trumpets at the beginning of the month and whatnot. So lots and lots of things going on. It continues for 7 days, and you are to celebrate the Lord's festival on the 15th day of the seventh month for 7 days after you have gathered the produce of the land. And there will be complete rest on the first day, complete rest on the 8th day. On the first day, you are to take the product of majestic trees, palm fronds, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. So think about this. These are branches of trees that all come from trees that you will find by streams of water or sources of water. So there's a very deep significance and measure of importance as goes the types of trees that are supposed to be used and where you'll find them. It harkens back to the garden imagery of Eden when they are supposed to reconstruct these shelters. Because even though he'll go on to say down here, you do this so that your generations may know that I made the Israelites live in shelters when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. We really don't have any information in the Torah where the 40 years of wilderness wandering, and really in the time when this is being mentioned here in Leviticus, the 40 years of wilderness wandering, number one, was never anticipated because it was really never supposed to happen. That came as the byproduct of them rejecting the Exodus and not wanting to go into the land to conquer it under Moses. Rather, that will happen 40 years later under Joshua and a whole new generation leading that effort. But it really speaks to the time of when they were out in the wilderness wandering from Egypt to Sinai, and then the short journey from Sinai up to the southern border of the land of Canaan. But in the Torah, we have no mention of them when they stopped being commanded to actually build these kinds of shelters using wood and maybe linen curtains and so forth to kind of keep the wind and dust away as they all sat down and did everything together for that 7-day period, living and eating and all of that stuff in these shelters. This becomes an observance that's supposed to take place when they actually get into the land, because out in the wilderness, the shelters that they lived in presumably were their tents. And so when they come into the land, of course, and now they're no longer required to live in tents because their life is no longer nomadic, but they get to settle down and live in walled houses in villages and cities, then they are to hearken back to this period through the remembrance had in actually leaving their houses and setting up these shelters for themselves. So with that in mind, one of the big pieces of significance to this is that it's for 7 days, which also connects it to the 7-day period of creation and the Edenic imagery to connect it to not only the creation account, but the fact that what was going on with the Exodus from Egypt was the ending of their exile there for several generations, a few centuries, and God's provision over them and amongst them while he leads them to the new land. And when they eventually get into the new land, it's supposed to be seen as a new Edenic space. And here, everybody is considered equals because it doesn't matter how rich you are, doesn't matter how poor or impoverished you are. Everybody is supposed to invite everyone to come together. They are to combine resources and they are to build these shelters so that everyone gets to eat equally around their tables and share in the goodness of the Lord while they remember his provision in the wilderness and his provision for them in the land now, and that he is faithful to his promise. Now, this is not the only mention, though, of how the Feast of Tabernacles or shelters is supposed to be observed. Going over to the book of Numbers, chapter 29, and I'm not going to read all of this, but notice how in Ezra, it is said that they offered burnt offerings based on the number specified by ordinance for each festival day. And in Numbers 29, this is the breakdown for that. So on the first day, they are to present a burnt offering, a food offering, a pleasing aroma to the Lord of 13 young bulls. But then on the second day, it decreases to 12. And with every successive day, it decreases in number, as goes how many bulls are supposed to be offered, right? That's really the only thing that winds up decreasing in amount, all the way down to the 6th day. So we go from 13 to 12, 11, 10, 9, and then 8. And then on the 7th day, it comes to 7 bulls. When you add all that up, it equals 70. Now, you might be wondering why I'm making any important mention of any of this. Well, here's the reason why. Because there really wouldn't be a reason for them celebrating hold on, let me rephrase what I'm about to say. There really would not be any reason for the person compiling the information that is in the book of Ezra to mention them celebrating the Feast of Shelters, if not for the significance of this particular feast and all that it embodies. Number one, with respect to the construction of these shelters, presuming that they did that. We really don't know if they went to that extent because it does not say that in the text of Ezra, but we presume that they did. But if they didn't, what we do know with absolute certainty is that they obviously followed the rubric of Numbers 29 and offered up the required amount of sacrifices every single day. And the reason why there is a decreasing amount of bulls each and every day, but gives us a sum total of 70, is because the number 70 in the Old Testament finds its significance first and foremost in Genesis chapter 11, with the rebellion of those people who all spoke one language at what will become known as Babel in the plain of Shinar, when they wanted to build that city tower complex that was going to unite heaven and earth together and presume to worship God in this quid pro quo fashion on the terms that they outlined, rather than how God wanted to be worshiped and has necessitated that he is to be worshiped. And God confounded their language. And with that, civilization begins to spawn into what we have nowadays, as goes a plethora of different nation groups. But it has always been understood from Jewish tradition that 70 nations were carved out from the dispersion at Babel. So that number 70 carried forward always carries with it the significance of the nations being involved symbolically in whatever is being talked about or done cultically in that particular sense, or the context of that passage. So what I'm driving at here is that the reason why 70 bulls are to be offered over a period of 7 days is to ascribe a huge measure of significance to the nations that are also supposed to be kept in the foreground here symbolically as this group of exiles originally coming out of Egypt, and now a new Egypt of sorts, that being Babylon, coming back to the land as their exile is ending and they are celebrating God's faithfulness and his provision for them. They are not supposed to forget the nations, who are really in exile and have been since the days of Babel. And that one day God is going to bring them out of that exile, and they are going to join with Israel and celebrate in this Feast of Shelters. Zechariah, a post-exilic prophet, says so much. I believe in Zechariah chapter 12 that they too are going to celebrate in the Feast of Shelters. And as scandalous as that might be to Jews of that day, that the filthy, unclean Gentiles could ever celebrate in this feast, because they would really have no idea how significant it is and what it ultimately means. They will one day when they get the chance to celebrate it. But what we should also understand and appreciate is that Zechariah does not mean this in a literal way, that there will come a time in the yet future era, future to us still, in which we are going to devolve back into offering up actual blood sacrifices. Instead, it's a remembrance of what God has done. It's a guarantee of what God will do in bringing the nations into the family of Israel, so that now they are one redeemed people, and that in and of itself is going to fulfill the measure of symbolism and the significance of this Feast of Shelters. Now, I bring that up because that has, I think, a huge measure of bearing and significance on the passage that we read today, as goes what's happening when they attempt to try to rebuild the temple. So moving on in Ezra chapter 3, in the second month of the second year at God's house in Jerusalem. It's interesting that they call it God's house, because at this point, it's just still a pile of rubble. They actually have not started the process of rebuilding anything. Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and the rest of their brothers, including the priests and the Levites who had returned to Jerusalem from the captivity, they began to build. They appointed the Levites, who were 20 years old or more, to supervise the work of the Lord's house. Now, this is important because this, in turn, also follows the guidelines that were given to them from Torah. And if you stop and think about it, the macro structure of the book of Ezra actually follows the construction of the Torah itself. What I mean by that is that Ezra starts off by mentioning the initial wave of exiles that come out of captivity under Zerubbabel and Jeshua. And with that, that seemingly mirrors the concept of Moses and Aaron. Even though both of them are descended directly from Levi, Moses is not a descendant from Judah. However, what we will see later on in the future, as Moses begins to set up the polity that will govern the nation, someday a king will come. And we already know from what Jacob had said to his sons as he blessed them before he died, kingship belongs to the house of Judah. And we have this tandem pairing of first Moses with Aaron, and then a descendant from Ephraim, not Levi, takes over for Moses as he dies in Joshua. And after Aaron dies, both Moses and Aaron dying before they enter into the land, Aaron's son Eleazar will take over for him. And in Joshua 18, when they set the tabernacle up at Shiloh, both of them govern together as God's appointed leaders, right? That structure falls out of practice for some time. The judges, of course, standing up and filling the gap of Moses' seat of power, but we really don't see any interplay with them and a high priest of their day. But eventually it will come back into the foreground in the time of David, when Abiathar and then Zadok come alongside him, both of them using the ephod, and eventually one of them ascending to the position of high priest under Solomon. And now at that point, we have a Davidic descendant and an Aaronic descendant. Remember, that's Aaronic, Aaronic, an Aaronide descended from Aaron, ruling as high priest. So all that to simply say, as they leave Egypt and they come to Mount Sinai, the Exodus has begun, exile is ending. They are corralled with God in his presence there while they are receiving the instructions for building the tabernacle. And they construct the tabernacle before they actually leave. They put it up for a very brief period, only to take it back down again, and then to start the migratory process of going back to the land. And then when they get into the land, they actually have to conquer it first before they can set up the tabernacle, and then start the process of trying to centralize the worship of Yahweh in the land as outlined by Moses as the agenda of what God wanted to do when they get there, not to adopt the practices of people there, but to centralize worship at the place where he causes his name to dwell in this structure that he has made for them to do. This is what's going on in the book of Ezra. They are leaving captivity. They are given specific instructions on how to handle the materials that come out of captivity with them and to take them back and to actually rebuild God's house. And Ezra sets up his journey when he leads a new wave of exiles to go back with him, as we discovered in previous weeks, to basically repeat the exact same steps of Moses, not from where he begins his journey, but of course where his journey will end, but kind of using Ezra's launching pad as if it were a new Egypt. He orchestrates his journey as being a complete repetition and reconstruction of how Moses led them through the wilderness, step by step, point for point, until they eventually arrive in the land. Go back to that lesson if you would like more information on that. So the Levites are supposed to supervise the work, but Moses in Numbers chapter 1 is told by the Lord in the tent of meeting in the wilderness of Sinai. Notice here, as I pointed out, these people are in or at the site of God's house when they start the process of building. Moses is in the tent of meeting in Numbers when he receives this instruction from the Lord. And this also happens on the first day of the second month of the second year. Why mention this in the book of Ezra if it's not meant to draw significance from the original account in Torah, that it happens on the second month of the second year, or I should say in the second month of the second year. Going back to Numbers, chapter 1, verses 48 through 51, that the Lord told Moses, do not register or take a census of the tribe of Levi from the other Israelites. Instead, appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony. This is what Ezra is saying happened under Zerubbabel and Jeshua, that they are the ones responsible for overseeing the process of laying first the foundation and then to build upon it, the temple. Back to Numbers chapter 1. They are to be over all its furnishings and everything in it. They are to transport the tabernacle and its articles, so handle all the holy and consecrated things. Whenever they camp, they take the tabernacle, whenever they break camp, they take the tabernacle down. The Levites carry it. When they erect camp, the Levites are responsible for setting it up. Back to Ezra 3, verses 10 through 11. So then the builders had laid the foundation of the Lord's temple. We have the priests dressed in their robes, holding trumpets, and Levites descended from Asaph. There's a reason why this is mentioned, holding cymbals, and they took their positions to praise the Lord as King David of Israel had instructed. And they sang with praise and thanksgiving to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love to Israel endures forever. Now, this is peculiar. Now, I hope you'll see this in a minute, but later I would encourage you, when you have some time on your own, to go back and search for the phrase faithful love endures using Bible Gateway or some app or tool very similar to that. And you'll see an abundance of that phrase being used all throughout the Psalms, and a few examples that I give you here. But to my knowledge, in none of those places outside of here in Ezra does the phrase exist where it says, his faithful love to Israel endures forever. And I could be wrong on that. I may need to go back and recheck that for myself. But it's still nonetheless significant that they would include that phrase here. And we'll talk about the reason why here in just a second. But there's a reason why they are all gathered around this site and they are beginning to sing, even though they've finished the construction of the foundation, but they haven't finished the temple. So why are they in this ceremonial fashion seemingly dedicating the foundation when the structure is far from being finished as goes the complete temple? We'll go back to 1 Chronicles 16, and this is the rendition that the chronicler gives, which adds, as is his custom, a lot more information than the writing we find in the book of Kings, as goes David's celebratory what's the word I'm looking for? Celebratory moment, I guess, when he is bringing the the Ark of the Covenant out of its exile, even though it's in the land of Israel, but it's locked away in someone's house. Obed-Edom and not in the tabernacle as it should be. And now he's bringing it up to Jerusalem. So on that day, David decreed for the first time that thanks be given to the Lord by Asaph and his relatives. So this creates a tradition and custom by which these Levites who descend directly from him become the musicians and choir members within the actual temple, and of course are attributed the authorship of many of the Psalms. He says, give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, proclaim his deeds amongst the peoples, sing to him, sing praise to him, tell about all of his wondrous works. So this is, of course, is happening when they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant up into Jerusalem. But David here is noted to be saying that they are to proclaim his deeds amongst the peoples. And this phrase, peoples, always means the Gentiles, the nations who are not a part of God's covenant people, Israel. And so if they are to, in an evangelical fashion, proclaim his deeds amongst the peoples so that they will understand there is a God in heaven who reigns, and they do not as of yet worship him, but they are being invited to come and become part of this people to worship him and to abandon the gods of their own making. It's significant, as goes what they're doing here as they are dedicating this temple, this new temple being built upon the ruins of the former temple, right? Because it would be invoking in their minds the original dedicatory moment in which David is marking the fact that a temple will be built in the capital he's carved out for his kingdom. And upon that site, the ark will find its final place of rest, not in a tabernacle that will be torn down and taken from one place to another, but instead God will dwell in this house for all time. He goes on to say in other verses, ascribe to the Lord families of the peoples. So again, invoking the nations. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory of his name. Bring an offering and come before him. Worship the Lord in the splendor of his holiness. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His faithful love endures forever. So all of this together is supposed to be part of what is being given over to the people, that they are to come in and be a part of Israel and appreciate the fact that God is good and his faithful love endures forever. He goes on to say, and save us, God of our salvation. Gather us and rescue us from the nations so that we may give thanks to your holy name and rejoice in your praise. It's fascinating that we do not have mention of this entire song in the book of Kings. Rather, it's the writer of the Chronicles who is writing this account of Israel's history after the exile is over with and they're back in the land. And he ascribes these words coming from David's mouth when these people have not yet went into any sort of exile in which this proclamation would have to be made. Save us, God of our salvation. Gather us and rescue us from the nations. It's not to say that David didn't say it and that these words are being erroneously prescribed to him. We should have every reason to believe he said them. And if he did, then they are prophetic in nature of the fact that, as Moses anticipates already, hundreds of years before David's born, much less becomes king, that they will wind up enduring exile from the land and be dispersed amongst the nations. But when they do, they are to come back to this place as God, the God of their salvation, who brought them out of Egypt, the exile that they experienced there, into this land he promised as a perpetual inheritance to them, that as he rescues them from the nations, they will come back to this place. And when they do, they will sing of the faithful love of God that endures, that is faithful to them in spite of their faithlessness. But again, it's an invitation to the peoples to join in with that as they are pulled from the nations. But by nations, we're not talking about the actual kingdoms they live in, but rather the dominion of darkness that they have been subjected to from the days of Babel. Another place in 2 Chronicles now, chapter 5, where we have Solomon dedicating the temple. The trumpeters, the singers, they all join together to praise and thank the Lord with one voice. They raise their voices, accompanied by trumpets, cymbals, musical instruments, all of which we have here in Ezra chapter 3. And they say, in praise to the Lord, for he is good, his faithful love endures forever. The temple, the Lord's temple, was filled with a cloud. And because of the cloud, the priests were not able to continue ministering, for the glory of the Lord filled God's temple, which, of course, goes all the way back to that moment in Exodus chapter 40, when Moses assembles the entire tabernacle complex and God descends from the glory cloud on top of Sinai down into the tabernacle where he takes up residence there, his new cosmic mountain. And now in 2 Chronicles 5, with Solomon finishing his father's work, and he's taking the one instrument, the one piece of furniture that we have any mention of being held over from the tabernacle and now incorporated into the temple, because it seems like he had all of the other vessels and articles of furniture or whatnot completely recast, completely remade, except for the Ark of the Covenant. That is transitioned from the tabernacle to the temple. And when they bring it in and they begin to sing of God's glory in this way, exalting him because he is good and his faithful love endures forever, God blesses this temple in two ways, the exact same way he did the tabernacle in Exodus. Exodus 40, by filling it with his presence in the form of this cloud, and then Leviticus 9 and 10 with the offering of sacrifices on the altar of burnt offering to install the priests in their office. And he answers with fire from heaven to consume those sacrifices. And he will do the same thing here in 2 Chronicles 7, after Solomon finishes his dedicatory prayer. And then, as the Israelites were watching, the fire descends and the glory of the Lord came on the temple. They bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshiped and praised the Lord. Why? Because he is good, his faithful love endures forever. This filters back to the instance of what's going on here in Ezra 3, because they are assuming, and they would rightly be assuming, that potentially if they are obedient to this and they complete this task, that God would do the same thing. He would fill this temple with his presence once more. Now, what's interesting is that he never actually does that. He will not christen it with his glory in the form of a cloud, nor with fire from heaven. But he does promise that he will return to Jerusalem. And the expectation is that he does that in a measure, inaugurating the fulfillment of what they anticipate will come. And Ezekiel himself does indeed forecast, before the exile is over with, that a new temple will be built. And when it does, God's glory is going to return, as he left the former temple, but now will come to this new one. And that glory will come. Malachi even says so much before he closes out the Old Testament and begins the intertestamental interlude of prophetic silence until John the Baptist shows up. But that will ultimately be fulfilled when Jesus arrives in the temple, and the glory of the Lord is seen at a couple different moments, with respect to Simeon's announcement in Luke chapter 2, or, of course, on the day of Pentecost, when in Jerusalem, the glory of the Lord descends in this form of fire and wind, as he had before, but instead of actually filling a temple space or the temple space, he instead lights himself upon people. We'll get to the significance of that here in just a minute. So in case I might have confused at this, what I'm simply saying here is just drawing attention to the fact that what they're doing here in Ezra chapter 3 harkens back to these moments of previous dedicatory offerings and moments of praise, as previous generations of Israelites were ascribing glory to God and saying he is good, his faithful love endures forever. But I also want to call attention to the fact that, as in the context of First Chronicles and even Second Chronicles, because remember, when Solomon prays the prayer he does, he includes the foreigner, and he says that even when the foreigner lifts his hands toward this place and he asks of you, please grant the request of his heart, so that he may know that you indeed are God, right? So the foreigners are not only part of the complex, right? I'm sorry, part of the process of building the temple, because several foreigners from the Phoenician kingdoms of Tyre and whatnot that Hiram ruled over were incorporated into the process of building. In fact, a Jew and Gentile hybrid in the descendant of the tribe of Dan, I forget his name at the moment, was noted to be the chief architect, much in the same way that Bezalel and Aholiab were over the tabernacle. So this Danite descendant, who also has mixed genealogy from with the Phoenicians as well, is utilized as the chief architect to oversee the entirety of the temple's construction. So the Gentiles have their place in this. Again, we are building upon the significance of that as we get here to chapter 4. So when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the family heads and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we also worship your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of King Esarhaddon of Assyria, when he brought us here." Now, we need to stop for a second and we need to call this into question. Enemies of Judah. And the reason why is, I think, going to become much clearer as we begin to search and explain this. But from what I've shared with you so far, it automatically should come into question for us as to whether or not these people were properly accorded as enemies, or were they erroneously accorded as enemies and listed as such here. And I'm not saying the Bible is an error. I'm just saying that perhaps part of the bias against them is what is infiltrating the text here, and that the author of the account himself is probably calling out the fact that their reaction to this plea on the part of this mixed group of people coming to them and saying, "We want to help you and assist you in this," was perhaps wrong. And I'll explain here in just a second. But I would say, from what we've read so far, we should anticipate the Gentiles will have an integral place in building the temple. They didn't in building the tabernacle, with the exception of the offerings that were made by the Egyptians to fund the tabernacle. They didn't realize that's what they were doing, but they give an offering that the Israelites are also going to give a free will offering from for the construction of the tabernacle. So they have a rudimentary place in it. That's expanded, though, when the tabernacle gives way to the temple. And as I've just said, we had Phoenicians who were helping in the construction of it, and we have the clearest and most obvious example of God's intent for Gentiles to have a part in this, not only from the dedicatory prayer of Solomon, but of course from the Jew-Gentile, or I should say Israel/Gentile hybrid, or person of mixed genealogy, if you will, who was appointed the position of chief architect over the temple itself, right? To show that God indeed wants the Gentiles to have a place in this. So when we go back to 2 Kings, not 1:17, that's a typo on my part. It should be just 17, but that helps us understand what's being mentioned here in this context of Ezra chapter 4. Wow. So let's read this. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylon, Cuthah, Ava, Hamath, Sepharvaim, and settled them in the place of the Israelites in the cities of Samaria. The settlers took possession of Samaria and lived in its cities. When they first lived there, they did not fear the Lord. So the Lord sent lions among them, which killed some of them. The settlers said to the king of Assyria, "The nations that you have deported and placed in the cities of Samaria do not know the requirements of the God of the land. Therefore, he has sent lions among them that are killing them, because the people don't know the requirements of the God of the land." So then the king of Assyria issued a command saying, "Send back one of the priests you deported. Have him go and live there so he can teach them the requirements of the God of the land." So one of the priests they had deported came and lived in Bethel, and he began to teach them how they should fear the Lord. However, these nations would not listen, but continued observing their former practices. They feared the Lord, but they also served their idols. And still today, their children and grandchildren continue doing as their ancestors did. So we understand, as this account eventually gives way to the New Testament material, and that there is a heavy amount of hostility between the Jews of both Galilee and Judea and the Samaritans, and the fact that they will not have any interaction with them, as noted very clearly in John chapter 4. Part of the reason for this is because they consider them to be hybrids, that the people who live there are of mixed Jewish ancestry, and because of its dilution with Gentile blood, it makes them less than. And they do make every effort to treat them like dogs or second-class citizens. Now, the reason why that's the case is because, of course, from what we just read in 2 Kings 17 and now Ezra chapter 4, there were people who lived in the territory that formerly belonged to the northern kingdom of Israel, who were resettled there because of King Esarhaddon and what he did in deporting people there from these particular places. So with that, those people who are completely Gentile go and they began to settle a region where there most likely was a very small remnant of Israelites left behind. Many of them were taken off into captivity, but the account itself does not tell us that every single person was taken away in captivity. And we know the practice of the Babylonians was to leave a small contingent of people there, far too small to raise an army or attempt to try to rebel. And we're literally going to have to try to scratch a living off the rocks left behind from the devastation of what the Assyrians and the Babylonians would do. But they would leave a small remnant of people there. So presumably these Gentiles who were brought into the land of Samaria and settled it would start to intermingle and intermarry with the few Israelites who were left behind until that gives rise to these mixed breed spawn that would survive several generations after them on up into the period of first century Palestine and Jesus's ministry. So the product of those unions in marriage between Israelites and Gentiles are part of the people who are coming here to this group of exiles returning under Zerubbabel and Jeshua, saying, we have been sacrificing to your God, who is also our God, since the days of King Esarhaddon. Now, of course, the person who says what they do in 2 Kings 17 with this final statement that still to this day they have continued on in their practices are no doubt observing some measure of polytheism. Be that as it may, the question then becomes, was this the right call to make on the part of this community? When we read Ezra the few times of the year that we actually probably do, and we read that word that begins in the first sentence here of the enemies of Judah, we automatically presume them to be nefarious characters. Let's put that on a Post-it note, and we'll come back and revisit that here in a second. I'm going to challenge that perspective, and I'm going to do so with what we are supposed to understand was their expectation and their anticipation of how the exile itself would end with this new Exodus and what was the role that the Gentile nations would play in coming alongside Israel. Before we get there, we continue on with this passage in verses 3 through 5. Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the other heads of the Israelite families answered them, you may have no part with us building a house for our God, since we alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded. So these people who are already in the land, meaning these Israelite Gentile hybrids, they began to discourage the people of Judah. Now you might think, well, this justifies the use of the term enemy at the beginning of this chapter, because now it seems like their true intent was revealed, that they wanted to come along and do everything they could to thwart the opportunity to build the temple. But in reality, we have nothing in the context that says that's the reason why they came. When we get to Nehemiah, we know that some of those rather nefarious characters have very bad motives in trying to do what they're doing to Nehemiah, to thwart the building of the wall. They even try to lure him into traps to kill the man. And with that, we are told in the context, this was what the person was doing. This is why they're conspiring to act against Nehemiah as they are. But if Ezra and Nehemiah is a joint work, we have nothing in this context that even remotely spells out that these people came with this intent, this ulterior motive in mind, that they wanted to do something to frustrate the plans. If anything, they may be acting in a rather petty fashion by discouraging these people from building the temple, acting out because of their sense of rejection on the part of this community of people that they feel they belong to, that they have an inheritance amongst because they worship this God. And this God has went without a temple presence here for 70 years. And they are excited at the prospect potentially of being able to join in building a house dedicated to him. And this would have been a very unique opportunity for this wave of Jewish exiles to begin the process of pulling these people out from their paganistic ways that they have syncretistically continued since the days of their Assyrian deportation into the land of Samaria, finally rid themselves of this erroneous practice of idolatry and really follow their Jewish heritage and inheritance, and become part of their Jewish inheritance by fully ascribing themselves to the community of God's covenant people, and with that, the true and pure worship of Yahweh. But that's not what happens. It says they also bribed officials to act against them to frustrate their plans throughout the reign of King Cyrus of Persia until the reign of King Darius of Persia. So let's go over here first to Isaiah chapter 2. And let's see what Isaiah has to say. He says, this is the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, that he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above all the hills. All nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways so that we may walk in his paths. For instruction will go out of Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem to the nations, to the world. So the nations will river up the mountain to receive instruction, the Torah of the Lord, where they meet with God at the nexus point where heaven and earth meet together on God's cosmic mountain in God's house, where the king of the cosmos rules and reigns from. And then they will river back down the mountain to carry his wisdom to the nations for more of them to do the same thing. This was Isaiah more than a century before the exile under the Babylonians ever actually gets kicked off, much less the 70 years that transpires and these people get released to go back to their homeland. So very clearly, the nations have a role. Now, you could say, well, it says the nations are supposed to come there and worship and hear the Torah, but not necessarily build the temple. Okay, that's true and fair. Let's continue on. Now I'm going to the left side of the screen over here in Isaiah 11. We are told this is a very clear messianic function, that on that day, the root of Jesse, the one who gives life to the line of kings and himself will be the culmination of the line of kings from David, will stand as a banner for the peoples. Remember, this is the Gentiles. The nations will look to him for guidance, and his resting place will be glorious. So he will stand as the rally point to which the nations will come. And presumably, this feeding off of what is already said in Isaiah chapter 2 will be on God's cosmic mountain. And Jesus says so much when he says that when he is lifted up, and where is he lifted up? In the proximity of Jerusalem. He will begin the process of gathering all men to himself, not just the lost tribes or broken houses of Israel and Judah. Further on in Isaiah's oracles, chapter 60, nations will come to your light. So the context of Isaiah 60 is speaking about the New Jerusalem. And it will culminate more so in Isaiah 65 and 66 as the New Jerusalem gives way to the new creation. And it becomes the moniker for what the new creation will be, this glorious city where the nations will come and they will revel in the work of the servant who has reconciled them to God through his own broken body and glorious resurrection as outlined in chapter 53, right? All that to say, the nations will come to your light and kings to your shining brightness, this renovated Jerusalem. But who are these kings? They are the kings that rule over the nations, right? So again, foreigners mentioned here, and they will come to rebuild your walls. So very clearly, Isaiah, in no questionable terms, is making it obvious that the nations are going to have a pivotal role in the reconstruction of the devastated city of Jerusalem. So Isaiah, after many chapters of speaking of the devastation that will come at the hands of the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, and that they will wreak havoc upon the city of Jerusalem and its temple. Yet here he is promising not only a renovation, but the fact the nations will come to pitch in. So if that's the expectation, then we immediately have to ask, and we should know this as Bible students before we read the accounts of Ezra. If we were reading it chronologically, we know that the words of Isaiah come well over a century to perhaps even before the days of Ezra. This was the expectation of these people if they were familiar with the words of this prophet, and they should have been. And we have every reason to assume that they would be. I see now on my screen there's a little bit of a lag or delay here. I'm highlighting things on my screen that's not quite catching up here. I'm in Isaiah chapter 60 at the bottom of your screen, but now I'm scrolling down a little bit more. I don't know what's going on here. Tell you what, I'm going to tell it to stop sharing, and then I'm going to make it reshare here and see if that will catch us up. So sorry, you have to look at my face for the next few moments while this is going on. Just give me a quick second. There we go. Now we just got to reshare. All right. There we go. So we continue reading on in Isaiah 60. Your city gates will always be open. They will never be shut day or night. So this is important. City gates are meant to keep out people who are not welcome. But to say that the gates will perpetually be open day and night, they will never close, is to symbolize an open invitation to the nations for these kings to come in, right? So they're not supposed to be shutting out people. They will never be shut day or night, so that the wealth of the nations may be brought to you. You will nurse on the milk of the nations, which comes on the heels of this. So, of course, the understanding is wealth is easily recognized in terms of valuable items such as gold, silver, bronze, various other things, as goes the expensive wares that are made by the nations, clothes, silk, spices, various other things like that. But the actual wealth of the nations are people. And this too is symbolized in the accounts that speak to the offerings that were made for the giving over of precious metals and whatnot for the building of the temple, but also the people who join themselves to that practice. So the most precious aspect of what's being given over as an offering is not simply the stones or the gold and the silver for the crafting and beautification of the temple, but the people who are involved in this. They are the true wealth of the nations, because again, what good is a pile of gold or silver to reign over by a king if he has no people to actually call his subjects? If he has no people to call his subjects, he has no kingdom. Sadly, this has been the history or the story of human history, and the fact that kings oftentimes place the wrong value on what they assumed to be wealth rather than what their true wealth was, and what is indeed the real wealth of God's kingdom, which is people, not capital, as goes gold and silver. Anyway, you'll nurse on the milk of the nations and nurse at the breast of kings, which is a very paradoxical phrase, because obviously men do not breastfeed babies. So what does this mean? But that kings will show them favor, like Cyrus has, that he will tenderly look out for these people and provide for them the way a father would provide for his son, or in this way, a king for a prince that he wants to be benevolent toward. He said, "You will know that I, the Lord, am your savior and redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob, when these things come to pass." So here we are in the context of Ezra's story, and there's a chance for them to come to pass. But instead of these Israelites, these Jews, being complicit with that, instead, they choose to go about it differently, and they wind up reaping the negative consequences of that. Continuing on in Isaiah chapter 62, he says, "I will not keep silent because of Zion. I will not keep still because of Jerusalem." So we know who we're talking about. "Until her righteousness shines like a bright light, and her salvation." Salvation, again, coming from the context of Exodus 15, deliverance out of exile, God settling them in the inheritance he promised, he planting himself amongst them by building his sanctuary upon his mountain. And then with that, the nations will come and enjoy the fruit of this garden right along with the direct descendants of Abraham through Jacob. "Until her righteousness shines bright and like a bright light, and her salvation like a flaming torch. Go out, go through the city gates, prepare a way for the people." So the nations are to also experience this. Build it up, build up the highway, clear away the stones, raise a banner for the peoples, so that they may come and join in with you in this exaltation and praise of the God of Israel. And then lastly, one of perhaps the most scandalous things that Isaiah could say, when he says in chapter 66, "Knowing their works and their thoughts, I have come together all nations and languages. They will come and see my glory." So no longer will this be something that is relegated only to the descendants of Jacob, but now all nations will experience this wonderful moment, like what happened at Sinai when they built the tabernacle and God's presence came and inhabited it, or on the summit of Mount Moriah in Jerusalem when the temple was finished and God's presence filled that space. Instead, now the nations will experience it. And I have to say, this is a very key motif of what's going on in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost, but I digress. "They will come and see my glory. I will establish a sign among them, these nations. I will send survivors from them to the nations." So in other words, I will bring them to me to see my glory, and then I will send them back out to the nations. Isaiah 2. I will also take some of them, these nations, as priests and Levites. I'm going to incorporate them into the priesthood of my people. So there's no question then at this moment that indeed the nations are going to have a pivotal role in not only building the city of Jerusalem, but even have a priestly role as goes what's supposed to happen in the administration of God's new kingdom economy. But we go back to Zechariah chapter 6 for a second, because this is not more important, but it hits a little bit closer to home as goes the fact that Zechariah is the prophet, right along with Haggai, who is working and ministering amongst them when the process of the building and the dedication of the temple foundation is occurring, and the process of beginning to build the temple proper, along with the wall of Jerusalem. And then you have this group of Jewish exiles saying to the inhabitants of the land who want to participate in this, no, we will build the temple to our God. Zechariah at the time will go on to say in Zechariah chapter 6, and when you've heard me allude to this before, but I say it again because it's important for us to recognize its connection to what's going on here situationally. There's a meeting here of Joshua, the high priest, or Yeshua, the high priest, amongst a few of the other nobles. And this is what Zechariah is supposed to tell him after he takes silver and gold and fashions a crown out of it. He says, here is a man whose name is Branch, messianic term Isaiah gives from Isaiah chapter 4, Isaiah chapter 11, a few other places. Jeremiah also uses it in a few chapters of his oracles. He will branch out from this place, and he will build the Lord's temple. So Messiah is going to build the temple. And he is somehow going to combine the offices of king and priest together in one, because this person, Yeshua, is the sign that bears this out. This truth that this will indeed come to pass. Wonderful, great. How is it going to happen? And this is all happening amidst the backdrop of the new temple being built. It's as if to say, as this temple is being built, it's not going to quite serve the purpose that God has anticipated for his people and this new temple that has been forecasted by prophets before the exile and during the exile. Because if he's supposed to branch out and build this place, is this to say that Joshua, the high priest, is now supposed to take over the process of finishing it out? Well, the Levites are in charge of being the foremans of this process to make sure everything goes according to plan. And Joshua, the chief Levite, probably has a significant role to play in all of this, but we're not actually told he is assigned a place in all of that. And if you actually march out the chronology, according to what some popular, or I should say, some very notable scholars have put together as goes, trying to mete out when the dates of the events of Ezra, Nehemiah, Zechariah, Haggai actually occur, then Joshua is probably a relatively elderly man at this point. In other words, probably in his 70s, maybe 80 years old at the time when this vision would have actually transpired. And very shortly after their arrival and the beginning of the process of building the temple with the laying of the foundation, he dies, and his son will take over as high priest from him. So if that's the case, the work that's being ascribed to him will not happen in his lifetime. Most certainly will not. So with that, he becomes the type of an antitype yet to be fulfilled in Scripture from Zechariah's vantage point. And the finishing of a temple will occur in the days of this person who takes up the role of the antitype, that being Jesus, obviously, the fulfillment of this messianic term, branch. So with that, that means that takes on a whole new layer of complexity then with all of these words said by Isaiah as goes the role of the nations in building and beautifying the city of Jerusalem and the temple and having a priestly role in this. And yet now we're being told that the administration of the Messiah, who's known as the branch, will be to combine the role of priest and king together, and that he will branch out from this place, building the Lord's temple, finishing this grand project beyond just the semblance of walls and roof and the overlaying of gold and all that stuff to beautify it, that the nations will have a role to play in that as well. Right? Then Haggai, the contemporary of Zechariah, as mentioned already in Ezra, he says this, for the Lord of armies says this, once more in a little while, I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth. That means all the powers, both cosmically and earthly, as goes kings and principates ruling in the spiritual realms above them. the sea and the land. Nothing remains unaffected. I will shake all the nations so that the treasures of the nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory. What do you have going on here? But the fact that not only has Cyrus done this, so he's not looking backwards to what Cyrus has done by giving them these offerings, or even so much to what Ezra may have already done. It's possible that Ezra has already arrived on the scene, depending upon which system of chronology you follow, or as I said last week, it may be 60-ish years or so before he is about to arrive. It could be pointing forward to that. But there's a much bigger context that Haggai is pointing to here with the words of the Lord. He says, the silver and gold belongs to me. This is the declaration of the Lord of armies. And the final glory of this house will be greater than the first. When the temple is finished and dedicated in the 6th year of Darius, there are people who weep for joy, or weep for joy when it's done. They weep because of the fact they realize it's not going to be anywhere close to what, well, I think that actually happens with the foundation. I believe that's right. With the foundation, they recognize this is not going to be anywhere close to the beauty and grandeur of Solomon's temple. But Haggai is not pointing forward to the beautification that will come during the time of Herod the Great. When through the taxes that he raises, he makes the ancient Jewish temple, the second temple, that was an expansion of Zerubbabel's temple during this period of Haggai and whatnot, one of the ancient wonders of the world with respect to its beauty and whatnot. That's not what he means. The glory of the temple is piggybacking off what Isaiah has said. The wealth of the nations, the milk of the nations, is going to be what comes flooding to you. And that is the true wealth of the nations, the people. You might say, well, here it says the silver and the gold belongs to me. Yes, this is true. All the offerings that have already come in and all the offerings that will once come in. But this also has an incredible bearing on the fact that there will be an offering taken up by Paul from the churches spread throughout the European Roman provinces that he has built or planted churches in, to come and relieve the famine going on in Jerusalem at the time period when he brings that money to them in the context of the book of Acts, right? And so with that, that is a true measure of God shaking loose the wealth of the nations to expand and beautify and demonstrate how his glory has filled the true temple, the temple made that consists of his people, not stones and gems and precious metals, in the context of the New Testament narrative, which is clearly borne out by Paul when he says the things he does in 1 Corinthians 6. Do you not know you are the temple of the Lord? Or 1 Peter chapter 2, with the fact that we are living stones fit together to become the suitable habitation for the presence of the Holy Spirit, right? But if that doesn't do it for you, then here it is in Zechariah chapter 6, when he finishes off this sign act of crowning with a crown of silver and gold Joshua the high priest and calling him the branch, saying he's the sign of what is to come. When in Zechariah 6:15 he says, people who are far off will come and build the Lord's temple, and you will know that the Lord of armies has sent me to you. When did that Zechariah say this? Did he say this before the foundation was built? Possibly. Maybe in Zechariah 8 we get a clue to that. He says, the Lord of armies says this, let your hands be strong, you who now hear these words that the prophet spoke when, not before, when the foundations were laid for the rebuilding of the temple. So we're not even talking about the temple of Solomon's day, this temple, that these words were spoken potentially then. The house of the Lord of armies. The Lord of armies says this, peoples will yet come, the residents of many cities, the residents of one city will go to another, saying, let's go at once to plead for the Lord's favor and to seek the Lord of armies. I'm also going. Many peoples and strong nations will come to seek the Lord of armies in Jerusalem and to plead for the Lord's favor. The Lord of armies says this, in those days, 10 men from nations of every language will grab the robe of a Jewish man tightly, urging, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Now, of course, there are several connections to be made here with the New Testament, but understand, this is what is being said in Zechariah's day when the temple is being rebuilt. In the interlude between when the foundation is finished and when the temple itself is going to be built, when Darius ascends to power, establishing his dynasty, right? So with that in mind, what are we to understand with this? That perhaps going all the way back here to this, the enemies of Judah maybe what they did when they turned them away and said, "You have no part in building this house with us," was actually a little bit too pretentious. And maybe they were wrong in making that statement. And maybe part of the reason why they suffered the adversity that they did after that is because this was the approach they took to it. After all, if these were the words of Isaiah and now Zechariah, why did they do this? Why? And one could also ask the question, well, then why didn't Zechariah come and he chastise them and say, no, what you've done is wrong? They are supposed to be helping us out because they are parts of the nations that were deported here. And granted, what they've been doing and worshiping the Lord has been wrong, but we can fix that. But this is exactly what the vision of Isaiah was and what the Lord is as he spoke through him. And now as he delivers these words through me. Well, there are several contexts and examples in scripture in which people are not doing exactly what God had outlined, but they are trying to remain somewhat faithful to the idea. And God, in spite of their inconsistencies and their misunderstandings, is continuing to bless and work through them to accomplish his agenda, which, of course, they cannot thwart, even though they caused this adversity with these Gentiles, these half-breeds who were trying to help them out. And even though this tension will last for centuries, yet Jesus will begin the process of rectifying that when he arrives on the scene. Now we move to Ezra chapter 6. So the house was completed on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius, right? And then the exiles observed the Passover on the 14th day of the following month, and they killed the Passover lamb for themselves, their priestly brothers. They all who had returned together ate it. They separated themselves from the uncleanness of the Gentiles. And what that very well could mean is that, granted, at this moment, it's possible if Ezra and Nehemiah are indeed in the land at this moment with them, that, and I recognize that might not be our conventional way of understanding this. I'm just throwing that out there as a possibility. If it's possible that they are, then, maybe the issues then that happened in the days of Nehemiah with respect to the intermarriage amongst Gentiles is part of what's being referenced here. But more than likely, what's being talked about here is the fact that the Gentiles in the land have these paganistic practices, and they have not fallen in line with that and synchronized themselves along with that, but instead have come back to the true worship of Yahweh, having been delivered out of the provinces of Babylon and Persia, where paganism was rampant. And as it was said by the pre-exilic prophets, that they would be deported off to lands in which they will be forced to worship gods of wood, silver, and gold and whatnot, because of the fact that they live amongst those peoples, and they will either succumb to paganistic practices or they will remain true to the worship of Yahweh and come back to this place to resurrect that when God allows them to be reassembled. That they have cleansed themselves from the uncleanness brought on the land from the Gentiles who have lived in these areas, right? Then they observed the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days with joy, because God had changed the attitude of the Persian emperor's heart to allow them to be able to do this. Now, this harkens back to the days of Hezekiah, when coming out of the madness of the rule of his father Ahaz for more than 10 years, and after his desecration of the worship of Yahweh in the kingdom of Judah, and of the temple, of course, with respect to what he was doing there, and building altars, and even replacing the altar of burnt offering with an altar he had built, replicating the altar of burnt offering that the king of Assyria, or I should say the king of Syria, was using in Damascus. When he went to visit the king of Assyria in Damascus, now newly conquered by Assyria, it's entirely possible it could have been the altar of burnt offering that the king of Assyria had built in its place. Either way, it's a pagan altar, and it replaced the one that was supposed to be dedicated to Yahweh in the land, or the kingdom of Judah. All that to say that he is working to cleanse the land of the impurity his father had brought into it, to rededicate the temple after he purifies it and repairs it from the disrepair it had fallen into. And then he sends out letters to the various tribes north of them, which, of course, the kingdom of Samaria remains intact up until the beginning of Hezekiah's kingship. But it would be during Hezekiah's kingship that the northern kingdom of Israel is captured or conquered, and those inhabitants eventually led off into exile. And so for the remnants of the land, he sends letters off to them, and he says, come and join us here in the kingdom of Judah, and here at the Lord's temple for the Passover. And some do. Some laugh and scoff, but some actually do. And so he is successful in working to rejoin several of the houses of Israel back to the house of Judah to celebrate the Passover. And what is the Passover supposed to mark? But the end of their exile in Egypt and the beginning of their exodus away from the place. Now, why that? Why mark this occasion of unification of the people by the celebration of Passover rather than the Day of Atonement? One could easily say, well, the significance of the feast itself, as goes the ending of the exile in Egypt and the beginning of the exodus away from the land. That's true. But here there's not really an exile in play for them when Hezekiah is ruling over the kingdom of Judah, at least not in a physical sense. There is in a spiritual sense, but not in a physical sense. Instead, you would think the Day of Atonement might be a more appropriate feast because the fact the land has been defiled by the actions of his father Ahaz, and of course, the wicked kings that have been ruling from Jeroboam the first to Hoshea, all 20 of those kings that sat on the thrones of Israel, that they would seek to be purifying the land to prevent God's wrath from coming upon them any worse than it already has. But instead, it's Passover. And the same thing with Josiah in 2 Chronicles 35, when after the madness of his forebearer Manasseh ruling for 55 years and doing much more wicked things, or many more wicked things than Ahaz ever thought of doing. And yet he works to try to do the very same thing, repair the temple, rededicate it, and he does so with this celebratory feast of Passover. So it sets the foreground and the precedent then of what will happen when the actual exile is over with and these people are coming back to the land and they finish up. And you might say, well, it would seem only right then that they would do it with Passover because they finished with the building of the temple during the 12th month of Adar, and the next month on the religious calendar would be that of the first month, which the Feast of Passover is to be celebrated in. They would have to wait another 6 months to observe and celebrate the Day of Atonement. That's true. But not only that, but the simple fact that these events are transpiring as they are in Ezra's time, or the time of Zerubbabel at least, to mimic what happened here with the previous kings of Hezekiah and Josiah, at a time when spiritual darkness reigned in the land and God brought a new king, a Messiah figure of sorts, to rule and reign over his people and to seemingly wink at the idea that God is going to allow a new exodus to begin someday. It will not happen during the time of Hezekiah or Josiah, but a king like them and much greater than them will rule after them. And when he does, he will bring about the final exodus, right? And so this, as goes the events in Ezra, are just an interlude, but a reminder of the fact that that promise is yet to come. When they dedicate or rebuild and dedicate this new, beautiful temple, and in doing so, celebrate it with the observance of Passover. And the fact that this lamb that is slain is supposed to hearken back to the time when God pulled them out of the exile of Egypt, now the exile of the new Egypt that was Babylon and Persia, brought them back into the land, which was the terminal end of the Exodus for that original group that came out of Egypt. Of course, it winds up becoming their children after them because of their sins in the wilderness. But nonetheless, the terminal end of that is them coming into the land and them meeting with God on his new cosmic mountain, which several generations have to pass before it's David claiming Jerusalem as that new spot and then beginning the process of building a temple there. Now these people are finishing that work in rebuilding a new temple and dedicating it over to God as they remember his faithfulness in Egypt. Remember now his faithfulness through this exile they have just been delivered from. And they should be incorporating the nations into this, but instead the nations are kept at arm's distance on the fringes here and not able to participate yet. But the story will be enriched all the more when Jesus invites the nations to celebrate and become part of the last and final Passover. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean, you would think, and that's the reason why I asked the question, that there would perhaps be a lot more significance to Jesus dying at the time of the Day of Atonement rather than the Passover in the gospel narratives. Why the Passover? I mean, after all, if we're talking about sin and being cleansed from it, there really isn't much of that going on in the process of offering up the Passover lambs, right? I mean, there is a measure of that. Don't get me wrong, in the original Passover story, as goes substitutionary atonement and one taking the place of another who was marked for judgment and certain death. But nonetheless, as goes the idea of sins being placed on one and then sent out into the wilderness, symbolically referencing the idea that God is not holding them against them anymore, while another one, what is to be seen as like basically an extension of the goat going off into the wilderness, this goat going now into the most holy place in the form of its blood being offered there, that would have made more sense on the Day of Atonement. And again, don't get me wrong, in the gospel story, both of these motifs, Passover and Day of Atonement, are being intertwined together with the tearing of the veil and whatnot in the tabernacle or a temple as Jesus is actively dying. But it happens at Passover. And the reason why is because the Exodus story becomes the backdrop by which the gospel writers are telling their story against, that crescendos, climaxes in Jesus's death and resurrection. So he is there too in Jerusalem as a Davidic descendant, celebrating the dedication of a new temple, which in John 2 says is his body. And later on in the writings of the other New Testament authors will go on to help us understand that we are that temple built upon the foundation of his body, right? So thankfully, while they missed the cue here from the pre-exilic prophets, that the nations are to be included in this administration of building the temple, they did not allow that to happen and suffered because of it, that Jesus actually is faithful to that mandate, and he intentionally the nations in that process with the building of the temple that will become the building built upon the foundation of his body. And that is you, and that is me. Well, thanks for listening. Let's close our time in prayer. Jesus, only you can make these things more relevant and clear to us. I'm grateful, Lord, that amidst my stuttering and stammering, my poor attempt at trying to teach this and make it relevant and clear, that you can do the very job that I perhaps have failed at. I pray that you would help us to meditate upon these words, and may it enrich our understanding of the New Testament narrative to your glory and our benefit. In your holy name I pray. Amen.